Ignatius of Antioch, who we've referred to before, refers to Mary as kind of proof of the real humanity of Jesus. In the homily this morning, I talked about the Gnostics, and there was a group of Gnostics that are very present even by the time of John's Gospel. And they are creating like a mystery cult based off of Christianity. And this mystery cult based off of Christianity, Jesus didn't have actual human flesh. He was a mirage, because this seems to be connected to the Manichaean idea that the flesh is bad. So God would not assume human flesh because God, who is all good, pure spirit, all holy, would not corrupt himself by taking on human flesh, which has been corrupted. And all of matter is evil, and so these types of mystery cults that were trying to adopt some of Jesus's teachings and kind of create a Jesus-type figure within their cult, they would sometimes attend the Christian services, but they wouldn't receive communion. And so this was what St. Ignatius of Antioch in the year 100 was writing so strongly against. He was saying, look at this. The same people who deny that Jesus was a real human are denying Holy Communion to themselves. Well, that type of logic is consistent. But we who believe that Jesus was really human in the flesh also believe that he is miraculously present in the Eucharist. And so he would insist that Mary truly conceived Jesus in the flesh and that it was a miraculous conception, but he would point to Mary as kind of a clear indication of the real humanity of Jesus. It's really interesting that the mystery cults had no problem with the divinity of Jesus, but they denied his humanity. The later struggles will be his divinity, and they will accept his humanity. But the first challenges of the Christian writers were these groups that denied his humanity. So Irenaeus of Lyon gets kind of credit for the devotion for Our Lady Undoer of Knots. Pope Francis really liked that devotion. Of course, he didn't invent it, but this was kind of the language of Irenaeus, looking for a way of describing Our Lady's role in salvation, Our Lady's role as the new Eve. And so, he writes, would somebody like to read this quote of St. Irenaeus?
Expounds upon this notion. The knot of Eve's disobedience was loosened by the obedience of Mary. For what the Virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, this did the Virgin Mary set free through faith. And thus, as the human race fell into bondage to death by the means of a virgin, so it's rescued by a virgin. Virginal disobedience having been balanced in the opposite scale of the virginal obedience.
And so the early Christian writers always included Mary at the core of salvation because they saw Eve at the core of the fall, but not the primary. They wouldn't say salvation comes from Mary. They would say salvation comes from Jesus. But they would be very clear that Mary played an integral and important role in the salvation in Jesus. And this concept was very clear from the Bible and from early Christian literature. So it was never a contested point. There's 2,000 years of consistent awareness that Mary has a unique and special role and is like she's a special human. Like she's human, but she's a very special human. And she is the new Eve who, in her own way, actually shares integrally in the undoing of the fall of Adam and Eve. Completely dependent upon the grace of Christ, because Christ is her Redeemer. If we move forward into the 300s, the late 300s, and we get into St. Ambrose. This is going to reflect a kind of looking at Mary as a model disciple. So St. Ambrose's sister was a nun. And seems like he would go to the convent and maybe teach and do retreats and things like that. He eventually writes a book, a long letter, to his sister and her convent. And in his kind of spiritual letter to these religious sisters, he is raising up Mary as kind of a good model for them to follow. And so definitely in the late 300s, you have Mary clearly being represented as the model disciple of Jesus. Like if you want to know how to follow Jesus, let's learn from what we know about the Blessed Virgin Mary, who was a great disciple of the Lord. And from this text, we can jump into a bunch. Saint Ambrose, who was the instrumental in St. Augustine's conversion to the Catholic faith, also saw a parallel between Mary and Eve. He, along with theologians and ecclesiastical writers in the Latin, as well as the Greek tradition, proclaimed her virginity in partu, during the birth, postpartum, after the birth, as did St. Hilary, Jerome. We see the perpetual virginity, and before the Council of Ephesus and the later councils. And so the questions of Mary as the mother of Christ, Mary as the mother of God, Mary as the one who gives a human flesh to Jesus, and they're still asking questions about Mary having children with Joseph after Jesus. Okay, they're still wondering about this, and there's discussion about that. We saw one text which basically gives an answer to the question of the children, right? And, well, Jesus' brothers and sisters are Joseph's children. That would be kind of the easy solution. But the fathers of the church are very consistent in their belief that Mary did not have any children after Jesus. John the Evangelist, nobody mentions other children. There's nothing indicating that there is other children. And so they start kind of developing a theology and a belief, and Ambrose is a good source because he wasn't Christian when he became elected bishop. So technically he was a pagan. He possibly, yeah, he was the governor of the Milan area, and maybe he was in the process, but he hadn't been baptized yet. And he was a politician who was very sympathetic to the Christian tradition, and technically from a legal perspective, he could tell the emperor, who was 5 years old, so the emperor's mom, that he was not a Christian, which she did not want a Christian, because she was an Arian, who was a form of Christianity, but she certainly would not have wanted a governor who was following what we would consider Catholicism. As the story goes with his election, he gets elected, he gets baptized, and then he's eventually ordained a deacon, a priest, and then a bishop. But in his political studies, he's gone to Constantinople many times, and he's dialogued with their theologians. And so he is very familiar with Christian theology, but as a bishop, he doesn't really write to anybody in Europe. The theology in Europe there's like big wars happening over the Arian group and the non-Arian group. And so he actually looks more to Constantinople and Cappadocia in Turkey to get the truth. And so he's writing letters to a group of theologians called the Cappadocian Fathers. He's fluent in Greek, and he's kind of learning theology from them. and kind of trying to follow what he would consider the true Christian faith. And he would see what the empress was doing as a variation of the true Christian faith. And so Ambrose was a man who was trying to, he must have had a great sense of integrity, but he wanted to live the Christian faith as it truly was. And so he had to go basically outside of Italy because the whole world had become Arian, as St. Jerome said. And in that kind of official Christian religion, Ambrose was very aware of this strong belief that Mary did not have children afterwards, and that she was a virgin before, during, and after. So that became the language. Mary was a perpetual virgin before, during, and after birth. Okay? And eventually that'll be defined in councils. That it was never really contested. There's never been like a massive breakup in the church over that one. Mary, the birth giver of God, there was a breakup over. But there was never, people seemed okay. Like everyone seemed to agree. Like, okay, Mary was a virgin before, during, and after. It's an interesting way of perceiving the perpetual virginity. And the during birth is obviously like the confusing one. Like, well, how can you be a virgin during birth? Clearly so what does the church intend when she says that Ambrose is very clear on? Well, like I mentioned before, the idea of Jesus being born with like labor pains and coming through the birth canal in a normal way was never held by Christians. She was, the perpetual virginity of Mary kind of revolved around the miraculous birth of Jesus. Do we know how that happens? No, there's some writings of like, there was like, the cave was filled with light, Mary goes into ecstasy, and the child moves from her womb into her arms, or into the crib. There's different ideas about how that might have happened, but what the church is very clear on is that Jesus did not come through the birth canal in a normal way. So Mary's perpetual virginity is connected to this belief in the miraculous birth of Jesus. Okay, and this is kind of helpful for a point of Marian dogma and theology. All of the Marian dogmas are to help give clarity to who Jesus is. Like, that's how they surface. There was a big movement, like I mentioned, against the humanity of Jesus in the first century by the Gnostics. And so the writers made it clear that Mary was like proof that Jesus was a human. Like, she had a physical baby in her womb, and the physical baby was born, miraculously, but born. Like, Jesus was a real man. And so the emphasis of Mary as the mother. Well, then, as you can imagine, as more groups started saying things like, well, we're Christians and we're followers of Jesus, but we don't think he's God, they would say, well, Mary's the mother of God. Not to kind of give this heretical idea that Mary gave birth to the divine nature before the divine nature ever existed. No, like Christians knew what that meant. It meant Jesus is God. He's not, he's human and God. He's divine and human. And so the title, Mary as the birth giver of God, became very important in Christianity in the context where people were saying that they could be Christian and deny Jesus as God. So you see how Marian titles and our kind of beliefs about the doctrines around Mary are all connected to clarifying who Jesus is And so Mary helps with that. So that's a fundamental principle for us to have in mind. So St. Augustine taught many doctrines about Mary. He held to her divine maternity, perpetual virginity, and even affirms Mary's immunity from all sin. Augustine also refers to Mary as the mother of the church or mother of the members of Christ, the totus Christus, sorry. But Augustine is the late 300s and the 400s. You know, the questions that are being asked. What questions are being asked? So what questions would be asked today? Does Jesus even matter? You know, I think that would be a question like, does Jesus help you be a better person? Right? I think that would be kind of the question that a lot of people have. Like, does religion help the world or does it make it worse? That would be kind of one of the lingering questions of society. Does Jesus actually make a difference? Maybe a less important question would be, is Jesus God? I don't think anybody cares. Like, the more deeper question, I think, is like, is religion even helpful? And is Christianity helpful? Or, and those are very good questions, because in the early church, that answer was yes. Like, the followers of the way were different than the culture. Not totally, not everybody, but by and large, an encounter with Jesus and following Jesus, they were very different in the way they lived. And a lot of people found that compelling. So eventually the questions started revolving around, is Jesus God? You know, and what do we mean by Mary being a perpetual virgin? If we go back a century and we kind of get into Rome, we see that even in the 200s, there is this ever-virgin language. We see, but the pious confession of the believers is the creator of all things, incorporated with himself a rational soul and sensible body from the all-holy Mary, ever-virgin, by an undefiled conception, without conversion, and was made man in nature, but separate from wickedness. Okay, this is a pretty developed theology for the 200s. Basically, this is a good summary of what we believe and what the councils will define over the next 400 years from this quote. And this text is a good demonstrator that the dogmas are defined only because they are held beliefs to be true, meaning that they were true from the beginning and that they were commonly held beliefs. The all-holy, the ever-virgin, undefiled. You know, Jesus was truly man. He had a human nature, but he didn't have sin. He had a rational soul, a sensible body. He was really fully human. You know, this is 210. So most likely that body of knowledge would come from the first century, the 100s. This next quote, meaning in the same century, but going into origin, is kind of interesting because he's aware of the Proto-Evangelium that we read from. You know, he is a priest from Alexandria who somehow ends up in Antioch. And we don't need to get into that, but he becomes probably the best biblical commentator of the first 300 or 400 years. And so, but he's aware of the Proto-Evangelium, the book of James, records that the brethren of Jesus were sons of Joseph by a former wife, whom he married before Mary. Now those who say so wish to preserve the honor of Mary in virginity to the end, so that body of hers, which was appointed to minister to the Word, Jesus, might not know intercourse with a man after the Holy Spirit came into her, and the power from on high overshadowed her. And I think it harmony with reason that Jesus was the first fruit among men of the purity which consists in perpetual chastity, and Mary was among women. For it were not pious to ascribe to any other than her the first fruits of virginity. So in the 200s, he's saying, he doesn't seem to say, I believe this text. He does say, but look, they were obviously very intent on showing that these were not her children because she was a perpetual virgin. Eventually, they're going to say things like, it just seems impossible that a woman who has been completely overshadowed with the Shekinah of God and conceives in the power of the Spirit, the Redeemer of the world, would in any way this temple sacred unto the Lord in any way be available for future work. This was like, you can't go down, right? You go up. And so there is like this great reverence for Mary as the temple of the Holy Spirit, as a tabernacle, as the Ark of the Covenant, as pure, as holy, and never defiled, as it were. And you can see these questions are lingering because the biblical texts are ambiguous. And so in Christianity, these questions linger. And sorry for the division of the page, but Hilary of Poitiers, he writes, if they, the brethren of the Lord, had been Mary's sons and not those taken from Joseph's former marriage, she would never have been given over in the moment of the passion, right, to John as his mother. The Lord saying each, woman, behold your son, and to John, behold your mother, as he bequeathed filial love to a disciple as a consolation to the one desolate. So we see in the mid-300s, they are still kind of explaining this. It's a question people have even today. Athanasius is an important figure. He grew up in Alexandria in Egypt. He was a disciple of Alexander of Alexandria. And Athanasius was one of the few bishops in the 300s who had the courage to go against the emperors who had become Arian. So Constantine calls the Council of Constantinople and calls the first Council of Nicaea. He calls the Council of Nicaea, right, in 325. They hold true to the faith at that council in 325. Shortly after, you have this massive break from the Council of Nicaea. You have a bunch of bishops who are teaching that Jesus is God, but is like a semi-God. Because if you're a politician and you have a bunch of people in your empire who are pagan, and then you have this new religion that is Christian, you're trying to figure out how to keep everybody happy. Right? So the politicians don't care what religion people follow. They just want them to pay their taxes and, go to war when they want them to go to war. They could care less about who's right or wrong. Now, sometimes some of them actually do care, but by and large, politicians aren't into that. They're just more like, okay, I've got a bunch of people over here. They're pagans. They like to have multiple gods. I've got the Jews over here. They've got one God. They've got their own rules. They got their way of doing things. And now I've got this growing group of people called Christian, and they're kind of like the Jews, and they've got one God, and now they're fighting with the pagans. And then this other group comes along and says, well, we're Christian too, but we believe that there is like a God, and then there's a smaller God, Jesus, and the politicians are like, cha-ching. This is really helpful. If you guys will just kind of accept this as an okay religion, you don't have to follow it, but just accept it as an okay religion, then this is the form of Christianity I like. And so Arianism becomes very popular. Now, there are sometimes people who believe Arianism. They believe that this is authentic Christianity. This seems to make sense. And it fluctuates back and forth. But what happens is that with the emperors basically leaning very strongly to the Arian and many bishops becoming Arian, there was few who were strong in supporting kind of like the traditional beliefs. And so Athanasius was one of the great voices. He wrote a book on the life of one of the early hermits, Anthony, that everybody agreed was the real deal. No matter what type of Christian you were, Anthony was the real deal. And he showed in his book that Anthony was a follower of kind of what we would consider Catholicism. And so he says, let those therefore who deny that the Son is by nature from the Father and proper to his essence, deny also that he took true human flesh from the ever Virgin Mary. Let those therefore who deny that the Son is by nature from the Father, so that's the Arians, they do not say Jesus is equal in nature to the Father in a consubstantial way. It is proper to his essence to deny also that he took human flesh from the ever Virgin Mary. Right? So that's another heresy, that Jesus was not truly human. So you can see how Mary becomes important in understanding like who Jesus is and how things go. All the texts around Mary in this era are around these Christological questions. They are all connected to answering the question in the mid to late 300s: was Jesus God or not? Was he fully God or not? Was he like a semi-God? What is going on here? And so it was really hard for people, because you got the emperor and a bunch of bishops saying one thing, and then you got another small group of bishops saying another thing. Athanasius was exiled many times. It was very confusing. When we get to the 300s, it's extremely confusing. But in the midst of that, we get some of the best theology in the history of the church. So this is referred to as the golden age of Christian theology, from about the year 340 up until 500. We have beautiful theology developed in the midst of these controversies. So Epiphanius of Salamis, I love the title, Medicine Chest Against All Heresies. Maybe he was a doctor. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things, both visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who for us men and for our salvation came down and took flesh, that is, was born perfectly of the Holy Ever Virgin Mary by the Holy Spirit. They're elaborating on a text. They're clarifying what we believe. So was born of the Virgin Mary. Okay, well, he wanted to say the all holy and ever virgin, just to make it clear. Just to make it clear. Right? And the Holy Mary, virgin, is invariably added, for that holy woman remains undefiled. So that's her perpetual virginity. Now, Jerome is a great early Christian writer, very, very dedicated to writing letters and doing translations of the Bible. Eventually becomes a hermit in the Holy Land. Lived for as a secretary to the Pope in Rome for a while. He had quite a life and was very prolific in his writing. He was highly regarded because he was one of the few guys from the European conversation that knew Hebrew and Greek. So by the late 300s, when you get into Europe, guys didn't know Hebrew and Greek. And so Jerome was kind of highly regarded for that reason and other reasons. But would somebody like to read? It's Helvidius produces Tertullian as a witness, right? So he's talking about other people's writings, right? So this is what we mean by the golden age of Catholic theology. They have copies of other people's writings. They're examining them, looking at them, dialoguing with each other. Even though they live in different countries, they're still engaging in these theological discussions, whether it was in Africa or in Europe or in the Holy Land. These main theologians are Turkey. They were writing to each other. And we actually have a good chunk of all those writings. It's kind of a fun little era of Christian history and literature. So would somebody like to, if you don't mind, I'll just get us through the first sentence because of the names. But Helvidius produces Tertullian as a witness to his view and quotes Victorinus, bishop of Patavium, of Tertullian. So here we go. I say,
no more than he did not belong to the church. But as regards Victorinus, I assert what has already been proven from the gospel, that he, Victorinus, spoke of the brethren of the Lord, not as being sons of Mary, but brethren in the sense I've explained. That is to say, brethren in point of kinship, not nature. By discussing such things, we are following the tiny streams of opinion. Might I not array against you the whole series of ancient writers, Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and many other
apostolic
and eloquent men who against the heretics, Ibion, Theodosius of Byzantium, and Valentius, held the same views and wrote volumes replete with wisdom. If you ever read what they wrote, you would be a wiser man.
Jerome had a witty punch about him all the time. He's always punchy, which I kind of like. Augustine said, if you have Jerome as a friend, you need not enemies, because he would tear down Augustine's writings as well. But look at all these different people who are engaging in these. Now, he does not say that they are, it says by kinship, right? A point of kinship. There will be a strand of belief that they were cousins of the Lord. That in the Semitic language, of the ancient Semitic languages, there was no word for cousin. So they are your brothers and sisters linguistically. So if you and I lived in first century Jerusalem and we were introducing the son of my uncle and aunt, who in English today we would say is our cousin, we would say, "Hi, this is my cousin." In the Semitic language that was active at the time, I would introduce him as my brother. Because they didn't have, perhaps the reason why is that the sense of family was very broad. Family was beyond just your mom and dad. The brothers of your sisters, of your mom and dad, produce brothers and sisters of you. And so that was kind of where you're going to have some of that belief develop. Right? So we believe that that God was born of a virgin because we read it. We do not believe that Mary was married after she brought forth her son because we do not read it. You, Helvidius, say that Mary did not remain a virgin. As for myself, I claim that Joseph himself was a virgin through Mary, so that a virgin son might be born of a virginal wedlock. Ha! So Jerome is basically saying, look, I'm not going to follow the proto-evangelium of James. I am going to dive into the language of the scriptures, and there's nothing here that indicates that they were children. They were kinsmen. They were cousins. And if you knew anything about these ancient languages, which you peons don't, you could almost see Jerome getting into this. But he was saying, not only do I believe Mary was a virgin, but I believe Joseph was. And so here we have very credible Christian theologians strongly disagreeing on particulars that the church allows us to this day to debate about or to have different beliefs on. But what is clear is that she was a virgin and highly held as a perpetual virgin, and the perpetual virginity of Mary is required. It's a requirement of faith, right? It's a dogma. It's a requirement of faith. But whether Joseph had children before is up for discussion and debate. Jerome firmly believed that Joseph himself was a virgin.
And that would make sense because he understood the language so well. He understood the Hebrew and Greek. So,
Yeah, John Paul II follows Jerome. John Paul II follows Jerome. Like, he really believed that Joseph was a virgin and they lived a Josephite marriage. That was kind of, I guess everyone believes that they lived a Josephite marriage, but the question was, did he have children before? That was the question.
I'm just so confused. You're saying that Jesus was not born through the birth canal, correct?
At least if he was, it was a miraculous way where everything remained intact. So she was a virgin before, during, and after, meaning...
What would having a baby through the birth canal have anything to do with virginity? Because I'm just saying,
Exactly.
virginity is lost by sex.
And that's why it was not. It was assumed that in the early church, that the perpetual virginity of Mary was not the part that says before, during, and after birth. So the part that says she's a virgin during birth is not trying to assert that Joseph didn't have sex with her while she was giving birth. Like that's not the point of that teaching. The point of that teaching is that the hymen was not broken and she remained physically intact. And so when Jesus went from the womb into the cave, he did so in such a way that her physical body remained virginal. And the most common held belief of the fathers is that Jesus left Mary's body like sunlight through a window. So like sunlight through a window.
See, and I don't understand why that makes a difference, because I like to think that if she was a woman and if she had this inside her, grew Jesus in her womb.
She did.
She got big.
Yes.
What is wrong if she did go through birth pains and stuff, just like all of us that have had children?
Exactly. There's nothing wrong with it, but the idea is that she didn't. Like that's the most ancient belief, and that's the consistent belief.
She was special.
So it's like, okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not what the early Christians believed. So
It was special that she grew him in our womb.
she did grow him in her womb. Yeah, she grew him in her womb. She had a natural pregnancy, but the dogma is that he came through in a miraculous way.
If you go back to Genesis, you can see, though, there's a passage in Genesis when he gets kicked out, where God tells her, you will now have pangs of birth.
Yes, that's part of the original.
Before that, you would not have in the Garden of Eden. And since she's Eve, and she is from the garden.
And she doesn't have original sin, so she doesn't suffer the birth pangs. Yeah.
Now that makes more sense.
Yeah. So she doesn't suffer the punishment of birth pains. But yeah, it is very different to the Christian imagination of today. You know, the movies and all that stuff. It's just kind of, but once you dive into the writings of Christians in the first 3 or 4 centuries, you're going to be like, okay, it was a miraculous birth. And the mystical tradition of the church, which is not something we need to believe in, but like people who claim that they had a vision from God of the birth, what they see is like light, and that it's more of a miraculous birth. Okay. Yeah, so we can look at 392. You had good reason to be horrified at the thought that another birth might issue from the same virginal womb from which Christ was born according to the flesh, for the Lord Jesus would never have chosen to be born of a virgin if he had ever judged that she would be incontinent as to contaminate with the seed of human intercourse the birthplace of the Lord's body, that court of the eternal king, blah, 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 blah. Bishop Anicius. But this just shows that this is, without question, the belief and the constant understanding of these 300 writers, that this is the tradition of the Christian faith, right? So that's kind of... Augustine, we could... do we have time? No. Oh, dear. Oh, boy. Okay. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. We'll get into the councils. It's kind of a strange area, right? This is a strange conversation in the modern sense, but this is the conversation if we look at Mary in the writings of Christians in the first 4 centuries. This is how Mary appears in the writings, specifically connected to who Jesus is. And so this is just a sample, but to be honest with you, it's a pretty good sample of the way in which Mary appears. I prefer the way John did it and the way Luke did it, right? It's so biblical. It draws you into the book of Genesis, and you're steeped in theology, but they were trying to answer specific objections and specific questions. And so that's what kind of drives this shift.
How common would it have been for a young man to be celibate during those days?
Boy, I don't know, to be honest with you. I don't know how common it would be. In the 300s, you have thousands and thousands of monks in North Africa, late 300s, 400s. And you have women too, like there. And so in North Africa, it became like this big, massive flooding of monks. After martyrdom kind of ceased, the monastic life really took off. And so a lot of the most zealous youth from Europe would go to North Africa and live for 1 to 10 or the rest of their life years living in these monasteries. And there were thousands of young men and women there. And then eventually old men and young men and women there. So thousands. And then you had, your priests. And so I don't know the statistics of like what percentage. But...
You had the Essenes during the time of Jesus too, so for Joseph to remain, he could have taken on the Essenes.
Okay, this is a very interesting idea. So where did Joseph come from? In ancient Judaism, there seems to have been a sect called the Essenes, and they would see the current high priest of Jesus' time as not a fake, but a scandal. A scandal. And they would see that the Judaism of Jesus' time had kind of strayed. So they had their own liturgical calendar. They had their own, they just disagreed on dates. Like let's say they celebrated Passover on this day. Well, they did it on that day. And in the Essene community, celibacy was common. There's a theory that John the Baptist came from this community, and that this community had a section in Jerusalem, so that seems to be a historical fact, that they had a quarter of Jerusalem. They had a section of Jerusalem that was the Essenes, and then they had the Qumran committee, the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? The people kind of hear the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so those seem to be connected. And so the idea of like embracing celibacy specifically for spiritual purposes and for the coming and prayer for the coming of the Messiah seems to be a part of their spirituality. And so one theory is that Joseph came from this community.
The writers from 80 AD to 150 AD, Ignatius, Polycarp, they would have been familiar with the Talmudic, rabbinic writings. Were they writing?
If they were Jewish, if they were Jewish.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they would, I mean, those early Christian writers certainly would have been, as you say, if they were Jewish, they would have been familiar with that genre.
Exactly.
And then the question as to why is that important, you know, in any part of this is, like, is Jesus man or God or both? It's important in that moment, but the answer affects all the theology that follows from that subject.
Yeah, it does.
So, like, divinity or humanity affects how we think about salvation. how
Correct.
salvation is accomplished. So when we're looking at something, Mary, the perpetual virgin, interesting in its own right, but it affects so many other elements of our theology, depending on what the answer is. I think that's where. And the other thing I know for me, like, I do not do well in uncertainty, and so these moments of uncertainty in theology and the ability to kind of maybe hold two things as true at once. I mean, for a common person, that.
Well, just say we don't know. You know, we don't know. Like there's theories. So we looked on Monday about, well, how does St. Luke talk about Mary? And then we looked yesterday about how does St. John talk about Mary? How is she integrated into his story? How is Mary integrated into Luke's story? And then the question for today was, well, how do the first early centuries of Christianity talk about Mary, and how is she integrated into this story? And so this is what happened. You know, this is what happened.
I just wanted to share what Mother Angelica always said about the topic of, was Joseph an older man or was he a younger man? She always said on her live show, old men don't walk to Egypt.
You know, there's something to that, actually. Yeah. It was that's a long walk.
Probably was just older than 12.
Yeah.
To your question, Father, is religion helpful? I mean, my response is gravity helpful? It depends.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah.
If you're walking on a flat surface or off a cliff, it's your friend or your enemy.
I think that's a great answer. I think that's a great way to reframe it, and yeah.
I'm so glad you showed all of his writings. It really showed how articulate, holy, and intelligent they are. And my first thing is we've got them so dumb since then. And it's always
Yeah.
amazing how all this goes together. You know, the purity and the holiness of the Virgin Mary, and the holiness of Jesus. And at least in the last couple generations, 4 or 5 decades, Jesus is just seen as a sort of cool guy, and not really that divine. And then the whole thing about, well, yeah, Mary can have other kids, and I mean everything just sort of falls apart. And here, I mean, even
Yeah, it's.
bishops talk about Jesus.
Well, I mean, there were clearly groups of Christians who believed Mary had other children, right? But you see this consistent thread going back to the earliest writers saying, no, like this is the tradition, this is the faith, and then it develops from there, right? It develops from there. And so you do have the perpetual virginity of Mary being defined. It went from language like the ever virgin to virgin before, during, and after. You know, I mean, so it develops a little bit. But yeah, we do have lunch, and I know everybody's hungry. Just joking. But I will say it's much more edifying personally to look at like the Gospels. But I do think it's important to look at the early Christian writers.